I want to offer my thanks to a colleague and friend in the history department, John Bodnar, the former director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and to the Institute's Ivona Hedden for their support in bringing David Chidester to Indiana University for this Branigin lecture. And my thanks also to colleagues in a number of departments who have been very enthusiastic in welcoming David to classes and lunches and seminars. David and I have been close friends since our graduate school days at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the late 1970s. In fact, we taught a course together called Religion in America Today in the spring of 1978. The fact that UCSB was willing to let both of us loose in a classroom together is probably of great concern, but that's a story for another time. South Africa is a long way, however, from our former home in Wisconsin for 25 years, although David visited us several times there and lectured throughout the state on those trips, often in very wintry conditions. And Cape Town is a very long way from our Bloomington home, so it's been a very special occasion for us to share the special place that is Bloomington with David and his wife, Corrine. And from here, very difficult duty awaits the Chidesters when they leave Friday morning, a trip to Paris and then to Sicily for several weeks. David is in the midst of a brilliant career. That's an oft overused term of praise, but it's the appropriate one in this case. For in his nearly 30 years in South Africa, he's become one of our leading historians of religion and culture. David is professor of religious studies and director of the Institute for Comparative Religion in Southern Africa at the University of Cape Town. Two of his books have received the American Academy of Religion's Award for Excellence in Religious Studies. In 1990, he received the award for Salvation and Suicide, an interpretation of Jim Jones' The People's Temple in Jonestown, published by Indiana University Press, I should add, and a revised paperback edition was released in 2003. He also received the award for Savage Systems, Colonialism and Comparative Religion in Southern Africa. His other books include Shots in the Streets, Violence and Religion in South Africa, Authentic Fakes, Religion and American Popular Culture, Wild Religion, Tracking the Sacred in South Africa, and a book to be released in 2014, Empires of Religion, Imperialism and Comparative Religion. His many co-edited works include Nelson Mandela, in his own words, From Freedom to the Future. David's talk tonight is entitled Wild Religion, Sacrifice, Sports, and Sovereignty in South Africa. Please, if you have questions for David when we're done, don't be shy. Please help me welcome David Chidester to Indiana University.
Thank you, Ed Linenthal. Thank you, the Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you, Mr. Branigin, whoever he might be. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Welcome to South Africa. This is our national coat of arms and our national motto. I'll be giving you some historical background. The key turning point is the first democratic elections in 1994. Prior to that time, South African history was constructed as a history of white colonization, white domination, white arriving with the first Dutch settlement in 1652, Jan van Riebeeck establishing a Dutch refreshment station in the Western Cape, proceeding through the British domination of the 19th century, the South African or Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, the 1948 rise to power of the National Party under the slogan of apartheid, and then 1994 first democratic elections. So before 94, oh, is that Walmart? They did not arrive in 1652, more recently, but so this history still lingers. Then, by contrast, post-1994, we've been involved in a creative process of revisioning history, and so that now, South African history post-1994, as enshrined in our central national shrine, Freedom Park, begins 3.6 billion years ago. This is the origin of South African history, the first sign of life, the first single-cell amoeba, the first trace of that evolutionary progression to humanity. We also have here the cradle of humankind. Scientists will debate this question, but the first hominids are rising out of South Africa. So we have a new kind of history out of Africa with a deep historical depth in which all human beings are included. You too are out of Africa. You too are South Africans. So on behalf of the South African Tourism Board, I urge you to visit South Africa. When President Thabo Mbeki introduced South Africa's first national motto and coat of arms in April 27, 2000, on South Africa's Freedom Day, which celebrates our first democratic elections, he invoked what I would regard as a poetics of the sacred, of sacred space and sacred time. This over-interpretation, perhaps, of this national motto, ICRSA, which means diverse people unite, or unity in diversity, or e pluribus unum. So a kind of motto for national unity and diversity. And then this imagery of two humans recognizing each other, mutual regard, mutual recognition. And when Thabo Mbeki explained the meaning of these new national symbols, he indicated that these symbols were both South African and African, that these symbols were both African and universal. So you find this over-interpretation, perhaps, but let's say intensive interpretation of these new national symbols radiating out from South Africa, to the entire world. He explained that these symbols were, first, natural symbols. They were media for revitalizing an indigenous, homegrown, local, African relationship with nature. So they're natural. Second, they're ancestral. They affirm an ongoing connection between South Africans and ancestors who came before. They recollect the times when our people believed there was a force permeating nature which linked the living with the dead. So these symbols are interpreted as natural symbols, ancestral symbols, and finally, universal symbols. They pay tribute to the universal principle of humanity, of mutual recognition, mutual regard, reciprocity, these principles of humanity enshrined in the African term Ubuntu. Well, it's a curious thing. These images were actually taken from Bushman art, San art. It was an image of a single human figure which, through the power of, what do you call this? Photoshop? I don't know. It was duplicated. And so you have what I've often called an authentic fake. It evokes authentic values, ideals, aspirations, and yet has clearly been manipulated here. Just between you and me, another thing that was airbrushed out was an erect penis. But anyway. I'm going to talk about religion, politics, and economics. I'm a historian of religion, so I shouldn't say anything about politics or economics, but I can't help myself. We'll be raising the central question of legitimacy in these activities of whether we call them religious, political, or economic. Where do we get this aura of legitimacy? Between theocracy and democracy, between discerning the will of God and mobilizing the will of the people, I'm going to argue that legitimacy is negotiated. Then what are the resources that are drawn upon to negotiate legitimacy? We'll be considering resources of religion. We have this notion of conventional religions anchored in churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues. I use this term wild religion for religion that is not domesticated, institutionalized, organized in these conventional religions. So one form of what is of religion that is not domesticated, institutionalized, organized would be indigenous religion. And we'll be considering indigenous, traditional, African religion, not domesticated, institutionalized, organized, but dispersed through cultural forms and social practices. And another form we'll consider is the religion of football. Then we'll be considering resources of politics. The contrast I want to draw is between constitutionalism. In 1996, we got a new constitution, a very progressive, human rights-oriented constitution with divisions of power, Bill of Rights, ensuring freedom of religion, freedom for religion. So constitutionalism, this is the great constitutional lawyer, Kader Asmal. In 2003, we edited a book which the collected speeches of Nelson Mandela. This is Nelson Mandela. That's Archbishop Tutu. I am way over on my right, your left. See, I went up to Nelson Mandela, I met him, and I said, Madiba, I am your editor. And he said, oh, what a sacred sound. I've cherished that ever since. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu pushed me out of the way. He's short, but he's strong, and he just took me out. So what I'm going to contrast is this balance between constitutionalism and traditionalism. And so here we have then, following President Nelson Mandela, President Thabo Mbeki, again, this balance between constitutionalism and Africanism, African Renaissance, traditionalism begins to shift and more emphasis on African tradition. And then in the transition from the presidency of Thabo Mbeki to Jacob Zuma, a surge of traditionalism, African tradition, particularly Zulu tradition, which is demonstrated and dramatized in a lot of ways. So in looking at politics, I want to consider this balance between constitutionalism and traditionalism. In much of this, we'll be guided by a sociologist by the name of George Bataille. He was a Durkheimian sociologist of sorts, and I've been influenced by his distinction in the world of economics between what he called rational economy, a conventional rational economy based on profit and loss, and a general economy of what he called expenditure, dramatic sacrifice of resources, loss of resources, destruction of resources. Now, one thing everyone can agree on is this sacred focus on the economics of the Football World Cup in 2010, the politics of the Football World Cup in 2010, and the religion of the Football World Cup in 2010. Now, football's not a religion, right? Football's not a religion. Football's not a religion. Soccer's not a religion. Football, the world's game, the beautiful game, the sacred game, is not a religion. Except people say it's a religion. And as the run-up to the World Cup, as we were getting very excited in South Africa, I'm looking at international commentators who are saying that football is, in fact, a religion. We have CNN national editor Dave Schechter adopting what I would call a morphological definition of religion, emphasizing forms, patterns, elements that go into making a religion. He said the religion of football is a religion. It has all the forms of religion. He said it has prayers, curses, hymns, vestments, transcendent gods, and sacrificial rituals. Quote, deities will be implored, sacrifices will be pledged, some even offered. All of his religious activity, so it's the forms of religion that he's identifying, a morphological definition of religion. He said it all revolves around a sacred center, a mobile sacred center that moves every 4 years, the Holy of Holies, the FIFA World Cup, moving to a different location every... Oh, no, next. Oh, that's better. The FIFA World Cup. So you have this formal definition of religion, that football's a religion because it has the forms of religion. By contrast, adopting a functional analysis of religion, from The Guardian, commentator Theo Hobson said football's a religion. By the way, it's better than any institutionalized religion because it works like a religion. It functions like a religion. As the great sociologist Emile Durkheim taught us, religion is beliefs and practices in relation to the sacred that unify people into a single moral community. So you have this unifying force. And he says, most religions, conventional religions, divide rather than unite. But football unifies people in social solidarity. One place says, well, you know, sometimes the Catholics get it right, but most of the time, religions are divisive, whereas football unifies. We should be very grateful for this religion. Anyway, we have these, in the run-up to the FIFA World Cup, people are describing football as if it's a religion in these different terms. We in South Africa took this very seriously. And we sanctified the religion of football with the resources of African indigenous religion, with African traditional religion, with Zolani Mkiva, who will be our star tonight. We will track his career tonight. In December 2009, speaking on behalf of the Makonya Royal Trust that was charged with coordinating cultural events, Zolani Mkiva announced that before the World Cup, at all the new stadiums that have been built, there would be an African ritual sanctifying each stadium, cleansing each stadium, purifying each stadium, empowering each stadium. At each stadium, a cow would be sacrificed. Well, the CNN editor got angry about this, the Guardian editor, what are they talking about? They're going to sacrifice a cow. So at each of the 10 stadiums, we must have a cultural ceremony of some sort where we are going to slaughter a beast, Mkiva explained. We sacrifice the cow for this great achievement, and we call on our ancestors to bless, to grace, to ensure that all goes well. In support of this, the government minister of traditional affairs said we must sacrifice a cow at every stadium. This will not only sanctify the event, but Africanize the event. Well, there was some resistance to this in the international press. I don't know if you remember any of this. It also occurred at a time of some controversy in South Africa about the role of traditional sacrifice. A month before, there was a controversy about the annual Zulu ritual called the Ukashwama, under the auspices of the Zulu king, King Goodwill Zwelithini, in which a bull must be sacrificed once a year. So there was an animal rights activist petition. They took it to court trying to block this animal sacrifice, and taking both the king to court, imagine doing that, and taking government ministers to court to try to block this ceremony. According to Animal Rights Africa, part of the ceremony involves young men having to kill a bull with their bare hands. Quite a dramatic description. During the Ukashwama ritual, men pulled out the bull's tongue, stuffed sand in its mouth, and also attempted to tie its penis in a knot. It's not as easy as you think. Anyway, whereas the defenders of this ritual said this ritual of sacrifice is just like Holy Communion in the Roman Catholic Church. It's a ritual that gives thanks to God for all that God has given. It is a ritual also that empowers the king. And a South African court agreed with that. And so you have, again, this mix of constitutionalism, jurisprudence, and traditionalism coming up with a kind of negotiated compromise. The judge in this case said if you did not allow this ceremony, you would not be allowing the symbolic powers to go to the king, to this transcendent king, this supreme king. It would be like killing the king, he said. Now, so there was this controversy going on. As it turned out, we only performed one ritual sacrifice at Soccer City, and it was presided over by, that's the elected president, and that's the hereditary king. All right, so our sacrifice was performed at Soccer City, and it was presided over by, organized by, Zolani Mkiva, in charge of ceremonial affairs, cultural affairs. And so as it turned out, 300 traditional diviners and healers, Sangomas and Nyangas, about 2,000 people. The ceremony began at 6 a.m. with the ritual killing of an ox by a 70-year-old Xhosa warrior. who's speared in the back of the head. Mkiva said he's doing this. He's doing this in the traditional way. They burn sacred herbs, perform cleansing ceremonies. The national coordinator of the Traditional Healers Organization, Pepsile Maseko, she said this ceremony would have 3 effects. She said it would unify people, so it would provide a unifying ceremony, would bring everyone together, unifying people, welcoming visitors, so this would be a way of inviting people in. And my favorite is alerting our ancestors, appeasing ancestors that many strange people are coming. Do not fear, these many strange people are coming. So then in the end, so this ritual is performed to sanctify the stadium. As Zolani Mkiva concluded, our stadiums are now officially blessed according to our culture for the tournament. So they had this understanding of the sacrifice as radiating out sacred power from Soccer City Stadium to all the stadiums, to all of South Africa, to all of Africa, to all of the world. This radiating power going out that would draw all the football fans in. So that's how that worked. Well, these are 2 different understandings of sacrifice. In the case of the Zulu king, sacrifice is about transcendence, hierarchy, centralized power, serving the king, whereas in the World Cup sacrifice, we find sacrifice understood on a horizontal plane as radiating out and drawing in, unifying symbol. End of part 1. Oh, I don't know, is that all right? That was kind of interesting. I mentioned George Bataille earlier. He has this notion of transcendence is the opposite of the sacred. Yeah, the transcendence creates alienation, subservience to a higher power, whereas the sacred is this energy that includes and animates and so on. Very different understandings embedded in these notions of sacrifice. Now, after the sacrifice, on June 11th, Zolani Mkiva, the poet of Africa, he began the opening ceremony with traditional praise singing, as an imbongi, a traditional praise singer, and there he is. I would like to play you, you may have seen this before, but an example of his art, his creative art of praise singing. He starts out, Sekunjalo, the time is now.
Sekunjalo! Sekunjalo ma-Afrika basha! Isizwe ngesizwe sehlabathi siyasondela kweli lizwe. Itakwalijonge kuthi ngolo hlobo. Makube njalo ke sikhumbule isithethe sethu. Khona ukuze silungise apho sinemangcele khona. Sitho sibhiyozela ubuntu bethu. Khona ukuze siphefumlelane ngendebe enjalo. Ethumntu ngumntu ngabantu.
So, traditional themes, Pambili, Africa Pambili, forward. A person is a person through other persons. Ubuntu. First National Bank? How did they get in there? And the FIFA World Cup. So this interweaving of religion and the economics of the World Cup, quite clear here. Zolani Mkiva was the praise singer for Nelson Mandela at his inauguration, doing similar performance of praises, evoking traditional African themes, evoking African ancestors, but then also taking an international perspective by singing the praises of Fidel Castro, Yasser Arafat, and Muammar Gaddafi. So now he was opening the festival of the 2010 FIFA World Cup. Gosh, that's a nice picture there. So we have this sacred time of festival, of exuberance, of celebration of the religion of football, reinforced through indigenous religious resources, a kind of time outside of time, a space outside of space, the sacred, yet entangled in economics and politics. Take the Vuvuzela, for example, the central oral icon of the 2010 World Cup. A plastic horn that produced horrible noise, you've heard it, and so on. But here's was a kind of sacred sound that broke through the profane world. It wasn't music, it was noise, you know, so it is reverberating, but it got caught up in disputes over property rights. It was claimed to be the property of the Nazareth Baptist Church, which had been founded by Isaiah Shembe in 1910 as a African indigenous, African independent church. The Shembeites claimed this was their horn. They had developed this as an instrument of worship. And they sued the company that was producing this plastic horn, saying, you have appropriated our sacred horn. When it's blown in the stadium, our Holy Spirit is being put in that stadium. You can't do that. You know, so it's a contest over the economics of it, the ownership of it, the ownership of the sacred. The manufacturer said, hey, we'll give you a franchise deal if you want to make a little money. Anyway, they settled out of court for a financial settlement. So even something as sacred as the Vuvuzela could get entangled in economics. Or in the case of the president of the South African Council of Churches, Tenyuku Maluleke, he said that the Vuvuzela was not an economic thing of value, it was a weapon that was going to be used, a missile that was going to be sent out to the rest of the world to awaken the world to Africa. So we find the Vuvuzela, the most sacred thing, being property in legal disputes, a weapon in global politics during the World Cup. Now, this reconciliation of the sacred and the profane, the negotiation between festival and cost accounting, was difficult to adjudicate when dealing with the World Cup in South Africa. Acknowledging the ecstatic enthusiasm and social solidarity generated by football, South African political philosopher and social activist Richard Pithouse ultimately found the World Cup Festival was an indictment of the African National Congress government that had abandoned the needs of the poor to offer a mix of empty spectacle, participation in empty rituals, and the fantasy of belonging to a unified society. By any rational cost accounting, there was an enormous expenditure, enormous investment, $3 billion for 6 new stadiums and 4 upgraded stadiums, untold costs for new infrastructure, such as $1 billion for an arguably unnecessary airport, $3.1 billion for an elite train service. So in other words, the costs were very high, and the profits to FIFA estimated at over $3 billion. I always like to ask this question. Do you remember who won the 2010 FIFA World Cup? FIFA! Yeah, they won the 2010 World Cup. All right. During that sacred time of the World Cup, FIFA took over South Africa, claimed sovereignty over South Africa, but it was contested. Well, you know, that's a picture from Robben Island, believe it or not. On November 5th, 2009, Zolani Mkiva, President and Director General of the Institute of African Royalty, convened a gathering of dignitaries at South Africa's Freedom Park, the central shrine of the nation, to bestow the first African Royal Award upon Nelson Mandela, who was praised as the lion, the king of the jungle, the icon of the nation. On the eve of the 2010 FIFA World Cup, the second meeting of the Institute of African Royalty met to convey the African Royal Award on FIFA President Sepp Blatter, king of, well, it's probably a remarkable transition from first democratic elected president, Nelson Mandela, he's a king, to Sepp Blatter, president of FIFA, he's a king. it was ironic because much commentary during the time criticized Sepp Blatter for being like the Pope, being like an emperor, being like a king. But someone like Zolani Mkiva took this opportunity to reinforce traditional sovereignty, traditional leadership, traditional kingship. So while celebrating the global sovereignty of FIFA, African traditionalists took this opportunity to reinforce the power of African traditional leaders. In South Africa, with a constitutional system, we also live with traditional leadership, 10 kings, 829 senior traditional leaders, 5,311 chiefs, with jurisdiction over chiefdoms that were created during the British colonial system of indirect rule, that were reinforced under apartheid separate development. So we have this system that continues. During the FIFA World Cup, Zolani Mkiva took the opportunity to crown a new Amatoza king. We have King Zwelonke Sigao at a ceremony with this Prince Conti. The build-up coordinated with the World Cup, with the FIFA World Cup, Prince Sigao said, will be coordinated with the coronation of the next Xhosa king. It will educate the general public about customs, rituals, norms, values, traditions of South African royalty. So here's this opportunity now to reinforce traditional authority, traditional leadership. The chief executive officer, another one. Chief executive officer of the Xhosa Royal Trust, Zolani Mkiva, he's back again. He said the link between royal ritual and the World Cup was important. Quote, "This event will take place at a time when the eyes of the entire world will be focused in South Africa, given the 2010 FIFA World Cup. Surely the coronation of His Majesty, King Zwelonke, will not only attract the local viewership and listenership, but the whole world." So again, taking this opportunity, the 2010 FIFA World Cup, to reinforce local sovereignty, local kingship, and so on. Journalists asked him how much did this coronation cost. They said, I heard the event cost 10 million rand. What's that in dollars? It's a lot. He said, heritage is priceless. So, although traditional heritage might be priceless, it nevertheless operates in a market economy. Accordingly, Makonya Investments, on behalf of the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, has formed a broad-based black empowerment company designed to advance the financial interests of traditional leaders. So the new Makonya Investments, under the leadership of its chairman, Zolani Mkiva. Yeah, so he's the chairman of Makonya Investments, National Executive Director of Comparative, chairman of Makonya Investments. He was committed to providing financial support for South African royalty. In its mission statement, Makonya Investments declares, "We take pride in having ensured that the kings and queens, together with the senior royals of our country, are direct beneficiaries of this investment initiative." This initiative secured lucrative tenders from governments, such as a 5-year, 3 billion rand contract to manage the vehicle fleet of the Eastern Cape province, which caused critics to wonder, what does a poet know about managing vehicles and transport and so on to run such an operation? However, as we've seen, Zolani Mkiva has had an extraordinary experience as the sacred poet of Africa and praise singer to Nelson Mandela, as officiant of the World Cup sacrifice and performer of the World Cup opening ceremony, as chairman of Makonya Royal Trust, president of the Institute of African Royalty, chief executive of the Xhosa Royal Trust, executive director of Colonialism, and chairman of Makonya Investments. So he has an enormous range of experience, which presents him on his website as HRH Zolani Mkiva, His Royal Highness, or His Royal Heritage, royalty in his own right. let's stop there for a second. We've woven together a lot of things here, and I said I was going to talk about religion, politics, and economics. And I've been using Zolani Mkiva as a remarkably creative innovator in all of these fields. A remarkably creative innovator in the field of African indigenous religion, traditional religion, officiating over traditional rituals of sacrifice. Enormously creative innovator in the field of politics, negotiating through this careful balance between constitutionalism and traditionalism, and an enormously creative innovator in the field of securing government tenders for the vehicle fleet in a province. So we were weaving together and layering together religion, politics, and economics. In conclusion, I just want to highlight some of the features that are interwoven here again. We've seen in indigenous religion, we find the role of ancestors, ritual sacrifice, the ethics of Ubuntu, of mutual recognition, and the sanctity of traditional authority. So indigenous religion operates in many ways. In the home, in the disciplines of ritual specialists, but also in the polity, in the larger political sphere. How do we reconcile then, as we move to politics, traditional legitimacy, traditional authority, which is genealogical, goes back to ancestors, makes these claims on indigenous legitimacy. How is that reconciled with politics? Three things here. In terms of the Constitution, we make provision for a House of Traditional Leaders. Here is the opening of the House of Traditional Leaders on 7 March 2013. So accommodated within the Constitution is already space for traditional leadership, for validating and valuing through a House of Traditional Leaders, through, and it's a very long name for a thing, a commission for the promotion and protection of the rights of linguistic, cultural, and religious communities. So there was an attempt in framing the Constitution to include traditional sovereignties. And yet, as I tried to suggest at the beginning, since 1994, the balance between constitutionalism and traditionalism has been shifting towards traditionalism. The weight has been shifting. And so, we have before our Parliament a traditional courts bill. This is Zolani defending that, which has been criticized for entrenching traditional authorities that were created by apartheid, for placing about 30% of South Africans under a feudal legal system, and discriminating against women, excluding women from participation. This is defended by Zolani Mkiva as recovering African ethics and African customary law. So we have these trends of constitutionalism, which allows for traditional leadership, and yet this increasing traditionalism. And then ultimately the third, in terms of politics, is what I would call Africanism. In October 2011, Zolani Mkiva performed a praise song during a memorial service for Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. This was in the Eastern Cape, a ceremony after the death of Muammar Gaddafi. It was presided over by a former football referee, Ace Nkobo. That seems appropriate, doesn't it? But with all traditional leadership present. The brutal murder of brother leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi marks a sad moment in the history of the mother continent, Africa, Mkiva declared. Muammar Gaddafi died for all of us as Africans. So these trends in politics demonstrated by Zolani Mkiva, constitutionalism, traditionalism, and this broader Africanism. When we turn to economics, we find just four things I want to mention. Internationalism. Here we find in April 2012, Zolani Mkiva awarding the first Mkiva Humanitarian Award to Fidel Castro. This was awarded in absentia. He wasn't there. But the point here being this, he was honoring Castro's internationalism and international cooperation. At the same time, you know, this has political implications, economic implications. We find international ceremonialism, like the FIFA World Cup. Have you heard of the Olympic Games? Have you heard of the Delphic Games? Zolani Mkiva was just added to the International Board of the Delphic Games. These celebrate traditional arts and traditional music and dance and other art forms. And so we find woven with internationalism is this international ceremonialism. Third, in the realm of economics, is what I would call creative accounting. Zolani Mkiva is currently suing the National Transitional Council of Libya for $4.5 million because he was commissioned by Muammar Gaddafi to write a song for him and has not been paid. So, and then last but not least, what I'm going to call magical banking. And here he is with James Wolfison, president of the World Bank. And this is another example of praise singing. It was last year. All right, that was the corporate logo of First National Bank, bestowing wealth upon all of us. If any of you studied cargo movements in Melanesia, wealth coming from extraordinary resources, what I'm calling here magical banking. So in conclusion, is that all right? I want to introduce to you. You know him, you love him, you can't live without him. I brought with me today Zolani Mkiva! Come on in! Oh. Maybe it was something I said. Anyway, I admire him very much. He's just really a creative innovator in these fields of religion, politics, and economics. And we've taken the opportunity to follow his journey through these different interwoven activities that all add up to what I would call a political economy of the sacred, in which the sacred is produced through intensive interpretation and regular ritualization. So the sacred is produced through this kind of labor, which results in a surplus of signification, a surplus of meaning that people fight over to own and operate and manipulate and make something out of it. Thank you very much.
Questions? All right, David, let me pose it to you another way. So it's very interesting, and but what's ironic or interesting to me is that you suggest essentially that the ANC government, the leadership in South Africa, is willing to work with this kind of commodification of traditionalism and ritual. Yet, from what I've been following, which is the labor conflicts and the Marikana massacre, quite the opposite is true. That is, the leadership is very quick to deploy a modernist discourse to say, these guys were nuts, they weren't willing to follow regular trade union negotiation channels, we couldn't talk to them, they rushed the police. Why? Because the Sangoma had given them muti and it convinced them that they were invincible. So how does one square what you've portrayed, which is a deep accommodation with traditionalism, with the deployment of a modernist discourse against workers who are drawing on that traditionalism to advance?
No, that's a great question. And this is, if you don't know about it, it was a police action against striking miners. Now, that might have been an illegal strike. an unprotected strike. So it didn't follow, as you're calling the modernist rules laid down for these sorts of things. And according to rumors, a ritual specialist, a sangoma, performed healing rituals for the miners to make them invincible to bullets, invisible. This was the rumor. Some substance that rumor was recently provided when that sangoma was murdered. If you know.
I didn't realize.
Yeah, he was. By persons unknown. Now, these resources of what I was calling constitutionalism and traditionalism, or let's say modern democratic constitutional order, rules and regulations, a modernist approach, and the traditional resources of ancestors, ritual healing, sacrifice, and so on. These are interwoven and layered and can be deployed at any time in different situations, strategically, sometimes tactically, so that it's not an either-or situation, that either the African National Congress accommodates tradition or not. It's not either-or. Now, we had this anomaly, if you want to call it an anomaly, already in the constitutional negotiations, to leave this space for traditional leadership, to leave a space perhaps for some kind of autonomy and self-determination for linguistic groups, cultural groups, religious groups. It was an anomaly that was already present. But we've lived with this contradiction ever since. And so that, when the African National Congress government wants to use a modernist discourse, they do. When they want to invoke traditional resources, they do. And much of the criticism has been that these resources of legal discourse and religious discourse are ultimately deployed to extract economic resources. So in a way, focusing on Zolani Mkiva, I've been trying to weave all these things together and avoid the either-or story.
I mean, I want to go on, I think it's a great question,
Yeah.
but I almost want to go on the other side. I kind of understand the idea of how the government would buy traditional cred when it can and then ignore it when it's not in its interest.
Yeah.
My question is about the other side. Does Mkiva have a problem when he has traditionalism for sale, losing his authenticity on the backside? So not on the corporate side seems like very willing to engage with him. He doesn't have people challenging his authority. Is that because it's simply hereditary and that's widely accepted? I mean, it seems like there's an idea that when you're doing an FNB commercial, someone's going to say you've lost your traditional.
You've
thread.
sold out.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah,
certainly
yeah.
in an American context or a Western
I know.
context, that would be the next step.
But again, these spheres are not separate. So the very thing we're saying, you sold out, is the very condition of possibility of him being a traditional Mbongi, a traditional leader, a traditional authority. So again, it's not either or. You sold out. This was the conditions of possibility for him to arise as poet of Africa, putting out CDs, doing performances, doing gigs. He was a musician.
But is there an
initially.
expectation that though that financial success is going to come back to the Kosa in any way? I mean, does he have an
Well-
obligation as king to share that? Or is anyone asking him to?
Well, there are, yes. So through the Makonya Investment Trust, money's being fed back into. But the last year, the cost for maintaining all these traditional leaders was supposed to be around 650 million. This comes out of public taxes. Yeah. Now it's a lot more than that, but it's quite a large public commitment to maintaining these traditional leaders. In addition to that, they have a whole host of what the social anthropologists Gene and John Komarov call ethnicity incorporated. Many business ventures, ethnopreneurs in tourism, hotel building, land development, a whole range of economic activity that's under the control of traditional authorities. The Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, at this most recent bull sacrifice, the Ukweshwama, was very angry, and he gave a long speech about how the government did not give him enough money to have a proper public address system. because it kept breaking down. You know, so these are very much interwoven.
So I guess a version of that question I'm interested in is there any, do you have any specific example in South Africa where the sacred's being deployed to resist corporatization or commercialization?
Yeah, yeah.
So, give us an example.
You know, in environmental movements, which you find sacred being deployed, you find indigenous African resources being deployed. You know, in Thabo Mbeki, talking about our national coat of arms. In the first instance, it's natural because it represents a harmony with nature, integrated in nature. So within environmental movements, you can find these sorts of examples. There are tree movements where people plant trees as an indigenous symbol, not the corporate logo tree necessarily, but so in environmental movements, in a whole range, you know, you can look at a whole range of things, homeless people movements, you know. So I mean, it can't happen against corporatization.
And sort of, I think it's a related question, so the difference you're drawing between, the distinction you're drawing about the way the sacred was deployed with the guy with from the Guardian and the CNN guy was morphological, and can you remind us what one was, can you remind us what the distinction was?
Oh, one was what I call morphological, the forms, and the other was functional. It works, yeah.
So I guess it seems that, so I guess I guess I couldn't understand, or couldn't quite follow how much difference that makes on the ground. Or how does that cash out, I guess, in a way?
Not so much, you know, really. It's just different ways of approaching it. If you use the word religion, what do you mean by that? And so one exercise to say, well, it kind of looks like a religion. So that's how they tested it. And the other guy said, no, well, I don't care what it looks like. It works like. And so these were two ways of entering the analysis of what counts, what makes football a religion.
But for your purposes, the point is that they both are in play.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm just curious about not so much the interactions or relationship between traditional religion and these other economic and political forces, but what, let's say, more recent and let's say traditional, by that I mean Christian, discourses had to say or comment on, or how they position themselves in relation to this phenomenon you're tracking. And the reason I ask, actually, is that there is a very interesting book written by the editor of, or one of the editors of the New Republic about soccer, which I recommend to you. I think it's entitled How Soccer Rules the World. And he's gone around and looked at, in many ways, the same thing what you're doing in metropoles in which soccer is king. All right, it's a phenomenal story. And in some instances, it really antagonizes a lot of religious conflict, for example, in Ireland. Okay? And so rather than being only a kind of unifying force, it's very much a divisive political religious phenomenon, right? And so I'm just wondering if there's anything like that that's worth tracking in this kind of context.
Yeah. Look, to use religion as a metaphor, you would quite clearly have divisions between supporters of different clubs, you know. But South Africans were taking this opportunity to unite behind a national team, South Africanness. Then the role of religion, besides this traditionalism, the South African Council of Churches composed a prayer. The South African Bishops' Conference composed a prayer in the shape of a football, which I like very much. So it was all this supporting, mobilizing, legitimating. I can't say that I would have seen religious divisions that you're describing. It was more mobilizing all kinds of religious communities. But now what was interesting, it coincided with the transition between the old Mbeki administration and the Zuma administration. And so in the Mbeki administration, President Thabo Mbeki had a National Religious Leaders Council that worked together for interreligious understanding, toleration, support. Zuma kicked them all out and put in a National Religious Leaders Forum, that was all about, as Zuma said to them, you must tell us what the Lord says. And if we go wrong, you know, in areas of abortion or gender rights or sexuality, you must tell us and set us straight. So the whole religious terrain was changing here. And, you know, President Zuma is also an ordained minister in a small evangelical church while revitalizing the Zulu traditionalism. Very conservative agenda is going on. But I didn't notice the divisiveness of
Other
We have
questions?
time for no more questions.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.